So when you have, let's say, a higher concentration of creatine in your muscles, creatine can also store higher number of phosphates with it, unless until you are in a state of calorie deficit. Okay, so that's why L-carnitine is useless when you compare two people's metabolism, right? So in ideal condition, everybody's metabolism will produce 38 ATPs from one single molecule of glucose, but realistically, the number is far low. Hey guys, my name is JC. I'm founder of Fitter, and this is episode 2, where we are going to discuss from where we left off in the last episode. We are going to talk about cells. We are going to talk about cellular respiration. This chapter is going to be an important one because if you understand this chapter, you'll understand how everything works at a micro level. In the last chapter, we discussed how the body has different kinds of organs, and organs are made up of tissues, and tissues are made up of cells. Now, today we'll go in depth of how these cells actually function. And once you understand how these cells function and how substrates metabolize in your body, you'll understand a lot more about supplementation. You'll be able to discern if a particular supplement is useful or not. Apart from that, you'll also understand a lot of macrobiology. Okay, so let's start with basics of cell. We have to go a few billion years back. The first cell, the first known cell, is referred to as LUCA, L-U-C-A, last universal common ancestor. And all the cells are derived basically from this cell, LUCA, right? So LUCA, over a period of time, after years of evolution, split into two different categories. One of the cells were called as eukaryotes, and the other one, prokaryotes. Right? So prokaryotic cells are typically cells which do not have a nucleus, and they also lack the organelles. Again, not getting into too many details, but I think the broad categorization would be that eukaryotes typically have a nucleus and prokaryotes typically don't have a nucleus. So when we talk about humans, when we talk about plants, when we talk about fungus, we are referring to as eukaryotic cells. We are eukaryotic cellular based organism. But when we talk about bacteria, those are prokaryotes. Okay, so we are eukaryotic cells. So everything that we are going to discuss subsequently in this chapter, we are going to talk about eukaryotic cells. Now, if you talk about a cell, and there are different kinds of cells in the body, like you have skin cell, like you have a hair cell, like you have bone cells. Remember, we discussed this last time. You have red blood cells, you have white blood cells. You have cells in each and every single part of the body. There's trillions of cells, right? And every single cell is unique in a way that it carries out a certain function. For example, if a skin cell is there, what would be its primary function? It would produce proteins like collagen, keratin, elastin, which would basically help in formation of skin, right? And it will also help in turnover skin. Over a period of time, these cells basically, they take birth, they evolve, and then they reach a stage which we refer to as cellular senescence, and at which point they don't divide any further and the cells die. So basically, this entire stage of cellular generation to cellular autopsis, the cells perform different kinds of functions. And the best way for anybody to understand how these cells function is by comparing this cell, an individual cell, forget about what kind of cell it is, but in reality, an individual cell to, let's say, a restaurant franchisee. Okay, let's call it a McDonald's franchisee, right? So when you go into a McDonald's franchisee, what are some of the things that you see? Obviously, if the restaurant is serving you burgers, fries, and Coke, there would be a central unit, a kitchen, and inside that kitchen, there would be some sort of a task sheet, which will be read by everybody, and they'll know, okay, today is Monday, and this is what we have to do, right? So there must be some sort of calendar, some sort of task sheet, which everybody will refer to, and they'll read from it, right? Then there will be cooks, right? People who would be cooking the food. Then there will be actual food, which is burgers, fries, cold drinks, right? Then there will be people who would be cleaning the kitchen, right? And then, of course, there's going to be electric plant or some sort of electric supply, which will basically power the entire operations for the machine. Then there would be a sort of like a miniature assembly line where the cook will prepare the burgers and somebody will package it and then give it to customers, right? In a similar manner, the kitchen, the entire McDonald's franchisee would have some sort of a boundary, some sort of a demarcation, right? Which is, let's say, an entry into the McDonald's. Like it can't be open from all the side. It will be open from a particular. So think of it like a security gate, right? So now this is what a McDonald's franchisee would typically look like. Now, if you talk about a cell, now pay attention because it's going to be much more easier for to understand what a cell does exactly. So in a cell, one of the most important thing is the nucleus. Now, nucleus is basically the host for your DNA. So when we talk about DNA or deoxyribonucleic acid, we are basically referring to instructions. Okay, so every single cell carries its own set of instructions. These instructions are stored where? Inside the nucleus. Just like how we had a secret recipe in a task sheet inside the McDonald's kitchen, we have DNA inside the nucleus. Okay. Then we talk about the endoplasmic reticulum. So endoplasmic reticulum is like a kitchen where you have two sides of the kitchen. You have smooth ER and then you have rough ER. So you can think of it as like a section of veg or non-veg. Okay. So in the endoplasmic reticulum, the rough ER, protein synthesis happens. And in the smooth section of ER, basically lipid synthesis happens. Then we have the actual workers, which is ribosomes and lysosomes. So ribosomes are actually cooks, which make the food, and lysosomes are workers, which actually clean the food. So in your cell, you have ribosomes, which basically make the protein, make the lipids, okay? And lysosomes are the workers, which basically clean up. So you would also have damaged components, so which will be cleaned up by lysosomes. Then you have the Golgi apparatus. Once the ribosomes have prepared the proteins and lipids, they'll be then shipped to Golgi apparatus, and Golgi apparatus is like final packaging and shipping unit, right? So if there's, let's say, a protein which is not folded correctly, Golgi apparatus will discard those proteins and or maybe add in something, and then finish the final product and ship it out of the cell. And then you have the cell membrane and cytoplasm. So cytoplasm inside a cell is like an intracellular fluid matrix, and all of these organelles are basically suspended in this fluid matrix. And it's also important because a lot of biochemical reactions happen in this space. So much like McDonald's seating area where a lot of people come, right? And then you have the mitochondria, which is referred to as a powerhouse of the cell, right? So all the metabolism, which we'll talk about, all the cellular respiration that we talk about, at the end of the day, its main function is to provide energy to the cell. So mitochondria basically provides this energy to cell so the cell can perform all of these functions. And then of course you have the cell membrane through which only stuff which is allowed can pass. Think of it like a security gate. So once again, you have nucleus which hosts your DNA, then you have your mitochondria which is your powerhouse of the cell, then you have ER which is you have rough and smooth, endoplasmic reticulum, so you have proteins which are synthesized in your rough ER and lipids which are synthesized in your smooth ER. Then you have Golgi apparatus, think of it more like packing unit. Lysosomes and ribosomes are workers which actually synthesize these proteins and lipids and clean up these proteins and lipids. And then you have cytoplasm, the intracellular fluid matrix, and cell membrane like the security gate of the cell. That we have understood what a cell really is and understand that there are different kinds of cells. A skin cell will have different components and it will have different kind of raw materials and it will produce different kinds of proteins, right? In a similar manner, an osteocyte or a bone cell will have different kinds of instructions, it will have different kinds of raw materials and it will produce different kinds of final products. So think of this as different kinds of restaurants. One could be a Chinese restaurant, one could be an Italian restaurant, one could be a McDonald's restaurant, or what could be pure veg Indian restaurant, right? So in a similar manner, your body has different kinds of restaurants or different kinds of cells requiring different kinds of raw ingredients and providing different kinds of final products. But the final products will always be what? Proteins and lipids, because your body is made up of proteins and lipids. So now moving on to metabolism. Now I talked about how mitochondria is like the powerhouse of the cell and it needs to provide energy to the entire cell. And remember, there are trillions of cells, right? So each and every single cell will have its own process or have its own mitochondria through which the cell will be provided energy. So basically, when we talk about body as a whole, at any given point of time, there are two different things happening in the body, right? Some of the things are breaking down and some of the things are building up. Okay, for example, remember in the example of the cell, there were ribosomes and lysosomes. Ribosomes were actually making proteins and lipids, and lysosomes were actually removing or discarding proteins and lipids. Why are they discarding and removing proteins and lipids? There must have been some sort of a breakdown, right? So there's always something which is building up, and there's always something which is building down or breaking down, right? In body, when we talk about something building up, this process is typically referred to as anabolism, okay? And whenever there's something which is breaking down or building down, it's referred to as catabolism. And this process happens simultaneously in your body. It happens all the time. It's not like, at one time your body is undergoing anabolism or another time it's going catabolism. This process happens simultaneously all the time. And collectively, this process is referred to as metabolism, okay? So, for example, when you talk about anabolism, a great example of anabolism would be, let's say, when your body makes up protein. Okay, for example, your ribosomes, they start making protein from raw material. Your muscle cells start producing protein for your muscles. Now, that would be referred to as anabolism. On the other side, let's say you consumed food, and the food will get broken down into, let's say, carbs, protein, fats, which will further get broken down into glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids, which will further get broken down into, let's say, energy. Right? So this process will be referred to as catabolism. So a simple example of anabolism would be cells producing proteins, and a good example of catabolism would be your food breaking down into the body and producing energy. That would be referred to as catabolism. Okay. In both the process, there is going to be some heat exchange. The whole system works because it's greedy for energy. Okay. Just like how in your real world, everybody is doing something for money. In case of our bodies, everything is driven because of energy. So when we talk about energy, what exactly are we referring to? We are referring to something called as ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. This single molecule is responsible for powering up all living organisms. So there's something called as ATP, ADP, or ATP-CP cycle, in which ATP basically breaks down into ADP and it releases certain energy. And to produce ATP, you require certain energy, right? So think of this as a currency, like how if you want to buy something, you'll have to pay someone dollars. In a similar manner, if you sell someone something, they'll pay you dollars, right? So ATP gets exchanged whenever there is transfer of energy. If your body requires energy, ATP will break down into ADP along with 1-phosphate. So now let's talk about a little bit more in terms of how this ATP-ADP system works, okay? So understand that ATP is your energy currency, and ATP is basically adenosine triphosphate. So there are 3 phosphates which are attached to adenosine. When you get energy, this energy is going to break down or separate or cleave off 1 phosphate from ATP, and ATP converts into ADP plus P. And this P further gets attached to ADP, and then ADP again converts into ATP. So that's a ATP-ADP cycle. Now, if you have understood this part, then you'll also understand how creatine works. So now you know the supplement creatine. Creatine basically monohydrate or creatine HCl or any of those, right? It gets saturated in your muscles. So your body already has creatine, by the way, and creatine in your muscles attaches itself to free phosphates, making creatine phosphates, right? So when you're doing high intensity training, and remember that this ATP production is very energy intensive, right? It's not very easy to produce ATP all the time, right? So your body requires a free supply of phosphates. So when you have, let's say, a higher concentration of creatine in your muscles, creatine can also store higher number of phosphates with it, right? So in case of high intensity training, when you're not getting sufficient amount of oxygen, this additional creatine phosphate can lend its additional phosphate to ADP, thereby producing more ATP. And that's how you get more energy during your workouts. So now you understand how creatine works. Now, this is primarily happening where you are not generating sufficient amount of ATP, which happens in case of, let's say, a glycolysis, which we'll discuss in a while, but not necessarily in case of Krebs cycle or a ETP, right? Because they get sufficient amount of oxygen, right? So if you understand this part, you will also understand that creatine is not useful for endurance runners or people who are doing long, extensive cardio or any endurance-based training. Creatine is not going to help them. Creatine is helpful for who? For people who are not getting sufficient amount of oxygen to perform glycolysis. Because when you are performing glycolysis, typically happens in the cytoplasm. Remember when we were talking about the cell and the intracellular fluid matrix, that was referred to as cytoplasm. So glycolysis happens there. But rest of the metabolism, your ETP and your Krebs cycle, it happens inside the mitochondria. right? Where you constantly get oxygen. But whenever you talk about glycolysis, always happens on the surface or the cytoplasm of the cell, right? In which case you're not getting sufficient amount of oxygen and the ATP production gets limited. So in which case, if you, let's say, supplement with creatine monohydrate, creatine will get stored in the form of creatine phosphate in muscles, and during times of high intensity training, when you're not getting sufficient amount of oxygen, when you are undergoing glycolysis, your body will be able to produce slightly more ATP. That's why people also report performance improvement when they take creatine. So now we have discussed ATP. Now ATP is energy currency, but where exactly is the energy coming from? Remember, ATP is energy currency, not energy. So energy must be coming from somewhere. What is it that we do on a regular basis that can potentially provide us energy? We consume food. And when we talk about food, there are certain things that provide energy. There are certain things that do not provide us energy. Let's say we're consuming a burger. Okay, a burger is basically what you have: a bottom layer, which is a carb, bread, and then you have a patty, which could be meat patty or paneer patty, in which case it's fat and protein. And then you have probably a slice of lettuce or something, and maybe a little bit of tomato and onions, which would be like fiber. And then you'll have your mayonnaise or whatever, which is again fats. And all of this will have some water in it. So when we talk about the food that you're consuming, you're typically referring to 5 macromolecules. You're talking about carbohydrates, fats, protein, fiber, and water. Now, fiber and water do not yield any energy. So when we talk about energy, we primarily use carbohydrates, protein, and fats. And even from carbohydrates, protein, and fat, body does not like using proteins for energy. Protein is typically used for the function of building stuff. Because remember, when we're talking about the cells for producing protein and lipids. Primary source of energy in the body is always carbohydrates. So anybody tells you your body does not need carbohydrates, well, body's preferred source of energy is carbohydrate. Of course, during times when you're not getting sufficient amount of carbohydrates, body can convert, fats into energy. That's more like a stored form of energy, not a preferred form of energy. And body can also convert protein into energy during starvation. Actually, let's just talk about glucose, carbohydrates, fats, their substrates, and then individually we'll go into details of how these are metabolized in the cell. So when you consume carbohydrates, they get converted into glucose. Similarly, when you consume fats, they convert into fatty acids. When you consume protein, they convert into amino acids. And then all of these 3 substrates get metabolized in your body in different manners. So when we talk about carbohydrate, basically it's a 6 carbon molecule, and at every stage it keeps dividing further and further, releasing X number of ATPs. So theoretically, 1 molecule of glucose can provide somewhere between 36 to 38 ATPs. And we'll talk about a full metabolism of carbohydrate, and we'll talk about it a little bit, okay? And then we'll move to how metabolism of fatty acids happen and how metabolism of amino acids happen. But let's first cover glucose metabolism, okay? So whenever I'm saying glucose, carbohydrate, I'm referring to the same C6H12O6. We also refer to them as CHO. So when we talk about the first step of glucose metabolism, is a process referred to as glycolysis. Now in glycolysis, basically what happens is glucose breaks down into first 6 glucose phosphate and then further breaks down into pyruvate. And this process, you get 2 pyruvate molecules and you get 2 ATPs. And then further, this process goes further and takes part into something what we refer to as a Krebs cycle or acetyl-CoA cycle or citric acid cycle. And then after citric acid cycle, we have something which is referred to as ETP or electron transport chain or oxidative phosphorylation. Now, combining all of these 3 processes together, the body generates a 1 molecule of glucose will produce somewhere between 36 to 38 ATPs, depending on which textbook you're reading. But this is an example of a highly metabolically efficient system. Now, and realistically, people would produce roughly, let's say, somewhere between 14, 15 to maybe 24 carbohydrates from 1 molecule of carbohydrate, right? So that's why you also see drastic difference when you compare 2 people's metabolism, right? So in ideal condition, everybody's metabolism will produce 38 ATPs from 1 single molecule of glucose, but realistically, the number is far low. So in glucose metabolism, the first step is glycolysis, which will produce 2 ATPs. Then it will go into citric acid cycle or Krebs cycle, where it will again produce 2 ATPs. And then it will move to ETP or electron transport chain, where it will produce the rest of the bulk of your ATP, which could be 32 to 34. And then we talk about fat metabolism. Now, when you consume fat, it's very easy for your body to store that fat in the form of triglycerides. So when we consume fat, that's fat, but what we also store, that's also referred to as fat. So when you consume dietary fat, basically it will get metabolized. Bulk of the fat metabolism happens in your intestines and your liver. And basically fats will get converted into triglycerides. And now these triglycerides can either get stored in your adipocytes, depending on how many calories you have consumed. If you are over and above certain calories, and we'll talk about energy balance probably in later chapters. If you have consumed sufficient amount of calories, then depending on that, these free fatty acids will either get stored in your adipose tissues in the form of triglycerides, or they will get into bloodstream where they can be taken up by your organs. So typically, if we have to talk about fat metabolism inside a cell, what happens is, let's say you're in a condition of calorie deficit. Okay, so remember there was triglyceride, which means that 3 free fatty acids and a molecule of glycerol. So the glycerol molecule will enter mitochondria, it will convert into glucose, whereas the 3 fatty acids will enter mitochondria and it will undergo a process referred to as beta oxidation, where every time the free fatty acids will keep on degrading until they form acetyl-CoA, which is the main substrate for Krebs cycle. Remember, because that's why we're calling it CoA cycle or Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle. So the free fatty acids will undergo beta oxidation till they convert into acetyl-CoA, and then they will go Krebs cycle, where they will further generate more ATPs, and then they will take part in ATP. Understand one thing, the free fatty acids are not getting oxidized outside of mitochondria, which means that whenever we are talking about fat metabolism, it happens only inside the mitochondria, which means it requires oxygen. And therefore, whenever your body is burning fat, this process is aerobic because it requires oxygen. Anything that's happening inside mitochondria requires oxygen. In case of glucose, it was also happening outside mitochondria and cytoplasm. Remember, glycolysis was happening in cytoplasm, not mitochondria. Okay? In mitochondria, what do we have? We have your Krebs cycle and you have your electron transport chain. So glycolysis would be an example of anaerobic respiration, and free fatty acid metabolism would be an example of aerobic respiration. Now, let's also talk about one more supplement. So remember that when you are breaking down your stored fat and it's converting into 3 fatty acids plus 1 glycerol, these free fatty acids are entering the cells. When they are entering the mitochondria to undergo beta oxidation, there is a carrier molecule which is required. Remember when we talk about security gate? So there's a security inside the cell and you need a certain enzymes to help you get through the cellular membranes, or let's say inside mitochondria. L-carnitine happens to be that, okay? And that's why a lot of companies sell L-carnitine. They say, hey, if you consume L-carnitine, more fatty acids will mobilize into mitochondria, thereby undergo beta oxidation, thereby provide more energy. And so that's why they sell L-carnitine. They're supposed to increase the flow of free fatty acids in the mitochondrial membrane and therefore increase the fat oxidation. But it really doesn't happen, because at the end of the day, it all boils down to calories, because the first step of fatty acid metabolism is that the triglyceride must break down into free fatty acids and glycerol, which it will not unless until you are in a state of calorie deficit. Okay, so that's why L-carnitine is useless. But from this process, now you understand what is the science behind L-carnitine. I've already told you 2 supplements. One is creatine and how it works, and 2, L-carnitine, how it works, primarily because now we are understanding how cell functions. Okay. So once the free fatty acids enter the mitochondria, they undergo a process called beta oxidation till the free fatty acids get reduced into acetyl-CoA. And then from there, the acetyl-CoA again takes part in Krebs cycle, and further it takes part in ATP, where the bulk of ATPs are produced. We also understood that whenever we talk about fat oxidation, it requires oxygen. Okay, fat oxidation cannot happen in the absence of oxygen. So whenever you're doing high intensity training, we are not able to breathe enough, which means you're not getting sufficient amount of oxygen. It will be referred to as glycolytic training. Whereas when you are doing, let's say, a jogging or an endurance training, or let's say cycling, it will typically be referred to as aerobic training or oxidative training. I hope this is clear. So now let's talk about protein metabolism. So whenever you, let's say, consume whole protein, the protein further gets broken down into amino acids with the help of proteases. And these amino acids can be absorbed in your intestines. From there, it can directly enter your bloodstream. And as you would know, like much like glucose and much like fatty acids, which are derivatives of CHO, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, protein is actually a derivative of nitrogen and hydrogen. So when you basically metabolize protein, what happens is the byproduct is basically ammonia, and this ammonia basically goes into your bloodstream. The blood gets purified by your kidneys. This ammonia then converts into urea. Another misconception when people talk about protein and they think, oh, it's increasing their uric acid, this should basically clear your doubt that the byproduct of protein metabolism is not uric acid, but urea made from ammonia. So it's very different product. The byproduct of purine is uric acid. Okay. Now, there are a lot of foods which are high in both protein and purine, which is why a lot of people get confused. And instead of stopping purine rich foods, they stop protein rich foods, which shouldn't be the case. So now you know that the byproduct of protein metabolism is ammonia and at the end urea, but not uric acid. The two are very different byproducts. Okay. So now basically, let's do a recap. We discussed about cells today. We discussed about different kinds of cells, eukaryotic, prokaryotic, and we are all examples of eukaryotic cells. And then we talked about different components of cells. We talked about the basics of cellular metabolism. We also learned the function of L-carnitine. We also learned about creatine. And then we also talked about metabolism of carbs, protein, and fats. And then we also looked into the brief of Krebs cycle. So I think this episode is going to help you guys in understanding basics of cellular respiration. If somebody wants to know more about these concepts, we are only touching at a very surface level. These subjects can get extremely complex, but if you're really interested in learning, I would recommend going to Khan Academy, start learning cellular respiration. That would be a good start, and then you can obviously go down the rabbit hole and it will open up a whole new complexity for you. So if this is clear, then in next chapter we'll talk about energy balance, we'll talk about enzymes, we'll talk about different types of diets maybe, and how one can create a diet for themselves. So I hope you guys enjoy learning from this chapter. And if you have any questions, if you want me to additionally discuss a topic in more detail, please do let me know in comment section and I'll try my best to clear it out. And this episode comes to an end, and thank you so much for watching.